So what's an unread library, a black box, and a flush toilet got to do with changing people's minds? Well, as it turns out, everything. And it all comes down to how we embrace our own ignorance and at the same time ask great questions. Hey guys, in case you're new here, my name is Hayden Richards. I am an emergency physician and this is Comms Lab. On this channel, I share my journey and what I've learned as I strive to develop myself into an effective communicator and an emotionally intelligent leader. In this series of videos on how to change people's minds, I'm drawing primarily from the book How to Have Impossible Conversations by Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay. One of my favorite parts of the book is the section where they espouse the great value of admitting your own ignorance. That's interesting. How do they support that claim? Well, to answer that, we need to visit something called the Unread Library effect. I never heard of that. Tell me more. So the Unread Library effect is their term for the phenomenon that we're all familiar with, where people think that they know way more than they actually do. Research by Robert Wilson and Frank Keel suggests that it is actually typical human behavior to confidently offer our opinions while lacking the in-depth knowledge to back those opinions up. It's about like owning a whole library of books and having read the front cover and maybe the blurb and adopting the conclusion that's expressed there without actually having read the books, without actually having accumulated the knowledge and the explanation for that conclusion.
Who would do that?
We pretend to others and ourselves that we know stuff when we really don't. A classic example of this in my work is the story of droperidol. Droperidol is a powerful sedative drug that has been around for many years. It's extremely useful for rapidly settling down agitated, violent patients who pose an immediate safety risk to staff or other patients in the emergency department. For healthcare professionals, it really helps us to rapidly control potentially dangerous situations without people getting hurt. In 2001, after more than 30 years of use, the FDA put what's called a black box warning on droperidol, because it was thought to cause a dangerous rhythm in the heart called dosage de pointes. Dosage de pointes. Even after 2005, when I became a junior doctor, I remember being warned off using droperidol, even in situations when it would have been extremely useful. When I asked what was behind the concern, I was simply told,
well, there is a black box warning, you know.
Worse still, and I kind of hate to admit this, but I became a droperidol naysayer, wisely warning junior staff away from the use of droperidol. And just like I did when those junior staff asked me for further explanation, I simply referred them to the ominous
black box warning.
You know, it felt good to appear knowledgeable in front of others, especially the junior doctors, and have them look up to me. And I suspect I even reveled in the mystique of quoting the black box. Of course, I never looked up what was behind the black box. And I kind of suspect that most of the people who quoted the black box at me hadn't looked it up either. If I had, I would have found that there were just 9 case reports of possible dosage de pointes in the setting of droperidol over the 30 years of its extensive use. In other words, the link between droperidol and this rare condition was extremely weak. Finally, in 2015, a study was published in Australia, in fact, that debunked the theory that droperidol was a dangerous drug. And these days, it's not uncommon for us to use droperidol to enable the safe care of extremely agitated or violent patients. Frank Keel and Leonard Rosenbelt further cemented the concept of the Unread Library effect in 2001. They chose an everyday object that most people are familiar with to test their theory: the flush toilet. Yeah, I know that you were waiting for when we were going to talk about the toilet. Anyone who's used a flush toilet before knows that after you've done your business, you press the button and whatever you've left in the bowl, along with the water around it, is sucked away to oblivion. But how does it actually work? Keel and Roosevelt recruited a bunch of people and asked them to rate how confident they were that they knew how a toilet worked. Most rated themselves pretty highly.
Come on, everyone knows how the toilet works. I give myself 10 out of 10.
Then they asked the volunteers a simple question.
So tell me, how does a flush toilet work?
Volunteers attempted to answer as best they could.
Well, I mean, obviously you press the button and then what happens is that,
Following their explanations, the volunteers were then asked to rate their confidence of their knowledge of the inner workings of a flush toilet again. And what do you think they found?
Maybe I'm more like a 2 out of 10.
Across the board, their confidence was significantly lower. To quote Lindsay and Boghossian, they realise their reliance on borrowed knowledge and thus their own ignorance. Now take note, the researchers never challenged the volunteers about what they thought they knew. They simply asked them for a deeper explanation. So how can we apply these findings to our mission to change people's minds, to be dealing with people who are coming at us with these seemingly crazy ideas? Lindsay and Boghossian have this suggestion: model ignorance. That means that if something someone else says just doesn't make sense to you, be prepared to admit that it just doesn't seem to make sense to me. Be prepared to admit your ignorance.
Gosh, I'm finding that really confusing. Maybe I'm missing something.
And then use open questions to get them to explain their perspective to you.
What's your understanding? How does a flush toilet work? So what's behind the black box warning?
Follow up the answers to these questions with more open questions. Be gentle, but be persistent.
Tell me more about that. So what are the specifics of the study? Look, I'm just a bit confused about how that explanation fits with what you mentioned before. How do you reconcile it in your mind?
This approach has 4 genuine advantages. Number 1 is that you're dealing with your own unread library effect up front. In other words, you're dealing with your own ignorance. You're admitting to it. You're admitting to the fact that there is a possibility that with an adequate explanation, it may turn out that this other person knows more than you. 2, because you're admitting to your own ignorance, you're creating an environment where it's actually safer for the other person to admit their ignorance. 3, if you're gently persistent with your curiosity and your questions, your openness, you'll eventually discover the inconsistencies in their argument, and so will they. And 4, because you're doing much less of the talking, they're actually much more likely to feel like you're really listening to them, that you're not going to challenge them, that you're not actually trying to change their mind. And therefore, hopefully, they'll be less defensive. Now, of course, there are 2 possible outcomes from this approach. Firstly, we've got to be open to the fact that you might actually find out that they have a better grasp of the subject than you do. And you might actually just then walk away with a better understanding. The second possible outcome, as Lindsay and Boghossian write, is that the more they explain, the more they are likely to realise the limits of their own knowledge. Open questions are also a great way to distinguish a person's position from their interests, which is actually an absolutely key evidence-based aspect of effective negotiation. And that is what we're going to be talking about in the next video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you there.